Defilements. In the Buddha's teaching, kilesas represent the mental defilements or afflictions that cloud our consciousness and perpetuate suffering. These psychological toxins distort our perception of reality and drive unwholesome actions, creating a cycle of suffering that affects both individual well-being and social relationships. At their core, mental defilements manifest in three primary forms: greed, hatred, and delusion. Greed manifests as an unquenchable thirst, a relentless pursuit of sensual gratification and material acquisition that knows no satiation. It casts a shadow across the mind, turning our gaze constantly toward what we lack, rather than appreciating what we have, leaving us feeling hollow inside, despite all our possessions. When we surrender to greed's influence, our moral compass falters, while ethical boundaries blur and fade as we advance our desires, blind to the consequences our actions impose upon others. The dark force of hatred reveals itself through aversion, anger, and ill will when we confront unpleasant experiences or perceived threats. This poisonous emotion compels the mind to reject what is actually happening in the present moment, breeding unnecessary suffering through its pattern of resistance and disapproval. Beyond damaging our own mental well-being, hatred can push us toward harmful actions against others as well, thus initiating enduring cycles of conflict and violence that extend far beyond our individual experiences. Delusion stands as the most fundamental of all defilements because it distorts our perception of reality. It manifests in three critical misconceptions. We perceive permanence in what is inherently transient. We seek fulfillment in conditions that cannot truly satisfy. And we mistake the fluid, impersonal processes of existence for an abiding, separate self. This profound delusion serves as the bedrock upon which both greed and hatred build their foundations, perpetuating rounds of suffering through our basic misunderstanding of the nature of existence. The impact the kilesas have on mental functioning is profound and far-reaching. They create cognitive distortions that affect our decision-making abilities and our emotional responses. When under their influence, we often act against our own best interests, as well as those of other people. The mind becomes agitated and unstable, unable to maintain calm or clarity. This mental turbulence manifests in various forms of emotional suffering, from mild anxiety to deep-seated depression. Moreover, defilements operate in subtle ways that can be difficult to recognize. They often disguise themselves as rational thoughts or justified emotions, making it challenging for us to identify and eliminate them. They also tend to reinforce each other. Greed might lead to hatred when desires are unfulfilled, while delusion can justify both greedy and hateful reactions by devising various excuses. The defilements act like uninvited guests who have taken residence in our minds for so long that we mistake them for the rightful owners. They color our perceptions, distort our thinking, and motivate our actions in ways that invariably lead to pain and discomfort. These defilements have been accumulating in our minds throughout countless lifetimes, becoming so familiar to us that we often mistake them for our true nature. At their roots, they are greed, hatred, and delusion, but they express themselves in countless subtle variations. Yet most of us hardly give them a second thought. It's rather like living in a house where unwelcome guests arrived long ago. At first, we simply took notice of their intrusion. But as time passed, we learned to accommodate them. We rearranged our lives around their presence until, eventually, we forgot they weren't supposed to be there in the first place. We may even defend their right to stay on, having forgotten the house was originally meant to be our own peaceful abode. Buddhist meditation aims to shine a light on these troublesome visitors, to see them clearly for what they are, to understand how they operate, and to discover that the mind's natural state when free of them is one of calm, clarity, and contentment. For it is only by recognizing these defilements and calling them out that we can begin the process of ushering them out the door. In Buddhist practice, we learn how to examine the nature of greed, hatred, and delusion in their various disguises. We learn to recognize their subtle workings and the many ways in which they manifest in our daily lives. Most importantly, we learn to explore practical methods to gradually weaken their influence, with the aim of eventually uprooting them entirely. Given, the task is not easy, but it is the most worthwhile endeavor we can ever undertake. For what could be more valuable than reclaiming ownership of our own minds? The defilements encompass all mental states that create suffering and perpetuate it, states that always lead to the creation of unwholesome karma. When we examine our minds honestly with wise awareness, we can observe how these defilements operate. Greed includes all forms of wanting, craving, desire, and attachment. When we see something pleasant, the greedy mentality jumps to the fore, expressing the desire to possess, experience, or acquire that thing. A person sees a beautiful item in a shop and immediately feels, "I must have this," despite having no real need for it. His craving then creates dissatisfaction when the desire goes unfulfilled, or it feels anxiety even when it is fulfilled, since he now fears losing what he's gained. Criticism often awakens our defensive instincts, sometimes kindling a quiet hatred that manifests as either aversion for the critic or a lingering resentment toward their words. This emotional response creates a distance where understanding might otherwise develop. A person who harbors a grudge against a colleague who received a promotion instead of him may experience a burning sensation of ill will by deliberately wishing that his competitor will fail at his job, which actually harms him more than the other person. These mental defilements function at 3 levels. Anusaya, or latent tendencies, are dormant defilements that lie beneath the superficial level of consciousness, but can be activated by appropriate conditions. They don't appear as active defilements until triggered by contact with a suitable object. These latent tendencies are quite subtle. They're like the roots of a tree that remain hidden underground. On the surface, you might think nothing is there. However, these tendencies are lying dormant within the mind. Take anger, for instance. When we're feeling calm and composed, we may feel that we are not susceptible to angry outbursts. But then someone blurts out something hurtful, prompting our anger to suddenly flare up. Where did that strong emotion come from? It was there all along as a latent emotional tendency, just waiting for the right conditions to trigger its response. These underlying prejudices are very persistent. Even when we're not aware of them, they influence how we perceive and respond to experiences. They're like coloring that tints our conscious awareness. The Buddha compared these tendencies to seeds. As long as a seed remains intact, it has the potential to sprout under favorable conditions, when it gets water, nutrients, and sunlight. Similarly, our latent tendencies toward greed, hatred, and delusion lie dormant until the right set of circumstances encourages them to sprout forth. When activated by circumstances, latent tendencies rise to the surface as thoughts and emotions. This is the second level on which defilements function. For example, when seeing something desirable, latent greed may manifest as active wanting. This shows mental defilements in a more dynamic state, when they've already arisen and are actively participating in mental activity. These defilements are experienced as momentary eruptions of greed, hatred, and delusion that flood moments of perception and begin to influence our behavior. We might say that this expressive level of defilements is like a storm that blows through the mind. It's only passing through, but while it's present, it can completely take over our thoughts, speech, and actions. For example, a woman is subject to criticism and feels anger begin to stir. Breaking into the open, this anger disturbs her peace of mind and creates immediate displeasure. If she clings to this angry response, it may lead her to speak harshly to others or even to seek revenge, thus opening the door to unpleasant karmic consequences. Thirdly, there is the transgression level of defilements, where unwholesome mental states exhibit themselves outwardly as physical or verbal actions that create unfortunate kinds of karma. When defilements aren't restrained at the thought level, they progress to the level of physical expression. This is the most obvious and coarsest level of defilement because it involves observable behavior. For example, a man feels latent anger arising due to his neighbor's behavior, which prompts him to dwell on thoughts of how his neighbor wronged him, so he begins rehearsing what he'll say in response. Eventually, he acts on this anger by shouting abusive words at his neighbor when they meet, thus making a verbal transgression that creates unwholesome karma, which will yield painful results in the future. Such transgressions are significant, because it's at this level where defilements can create the most severe karma. However, it's also the level where moral restraint can be most effectively practiced, because we can observe the intentions behind our bodily and verbal actions more readily at this stage than when they are only subtle mental tendencies. When we look closely at the defilements, we begin to see that they aren't solid things at all. Rather, they are mental processes that pull the mind in contradictory directions. When examining the defilements, we find they operate by means of an inherent contradiction. That is, they lure us with promises of happiness while containing the very elements that make lasting satisfaction impossible. This contradiction is precisely what makes them such prolific producers of pain and suffering. Consider how we experience moments of desire. We pursue a desirable object believing it will bring fulfillment, yet upon obtaining it, the satisfaction quickly fades. This occurs because desire itself is unstable. It shifts its attention, clings briefly, then it redirects its focus continuously. One desire leads to another in an endless chain, never allowing us to reach a state of lasting contentment. The defilements lack coherence in their fundamental nature. Greed pulls us toward accumulation while simultaneously fostering fear of loss. Anger promises power and resolution, but it leaves us feeling depleted and isolated. Delusion offers comfortable narratives that temporarily soothe our anxieties, while at the same time disconnecting us from reality. This incoherence manifests in our emotional experiences as well. When gripped by strong defilements, we often feel a sense of inner fragmentation. Part of us wants to indulge, while another part recognizes the harm of that indulgence. This internal conflict itself becomes a continuous source of apprehension. The Buddha recognized that, because they lack consistency, mental defilements cannot be trusted. They promise one thing while delivering another. They appear as allies in our pursuit of happiness, while secretly undermining that very pursuit. What makes the Buddha's teaching so revolutionary is not merely that it identifies this problem, but also that his training methods offer a path that leads beyond it. By cultivating mindfulness and clear comprehension, we begin to recognize the confusing picture that the defilements exhibit. We see how they create the very suffering they claim to alleviate. By virtue of this understanding, we begin to catch a glimpse of what true freedom looks like. This basic contradiction is compounded by the fact that each mental defilement represents its own unique combination of greed, hatred, and delusion. Pride, for instance, arises when delusion convinces us we're something special, while greed becomes attached to that self-image. There's also a subtle aversion present, a pushing away of others who might threaten our inflated sense of self. Jealousy combines hatred's resistance to others' success with greed's desire to possess what they have. Delusion provides the misunderstanding that another's gain somehow diminishes us. Stinginess is primarily greed, holding tightly to possessions, but there's hatred involved too, which is expressed as fear and aversion toward possible loss. Delusion blinds us to the truth that all things are impermanent anyway. Worry appears when delusion misinterprets past events, and hatred resents what cannot now be changed, while greed clings to potential alternative outcomes that never happened. Restlessness occurs when delusion creates confusion, greed hungers for stimulation, and hatred resists every present moment situation as unsatisfactory. Drowsiness combines delusion's ignorance of reality with a subtle aversion to putting forth effort, while greed attaches to the comfort of simply being oblivious to what's happening. Doubt is primarily caused by delusion, but it also contains greed's attachment to multiple possibilities and hatred's resistance to committing to any of them. Sensual desire is obviously greed-dominant, but delusion provides the false promise that sensual gratification will bring lasting happiness, while hatred manifests as the emotional frustration that keeps pushing for more. Ill will appears predominantly as hatred, yet contains greed's attachment to our own views and preferences, with delusion providing the false notion that the feelings of others don't matter. Each defilement tugs the mind in contradictory directions. We want something, yet we push it away. We often cling to what we hate, and we are constantly confused about what we really want. This is why defilements cause us so much suffering. They are inherently unstable and conflict-ridden combinations of mental hindrances. Through meditative practice, we come to perceive defilements not as fixed components of our identity, but as transient processes, each exhibiting its distinctive configuration of greed, hatred, and delusion. This insight allows us to distance ourselves from these states, recognizing that this is merely a process unfolding. It's not me or mine. Such recognition marks the first step toward freedom from their influence. So, where do these defilements begin? They begin with a fundamental ignorance of reality we call avidya. The relationship between mental defilements and fundamental ignorance is central to understanding the Buddhist path. When we examine this connection carefully, we see how these two elements interlock to keep the cycle of suffering in motion, and why their elimination is essential for freeing the mind of suffering and its consequences. Avidya is not merely a shortage of information or a lack of knowledge in the conventional sense. It is a profound blindness to the true nature of existence. This unawareness represents an inherent delusion concerning the Four Noble Truths. That is, an inability to comprehend the dynamic relationship between suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path leading to its cessation. When the mind sees falsely in this fundamental way, it becomes fertile ground for a variety of defilements to arise and flourish. Greed, hatred, and delusion in their various forms are like weeds growing from the soil of ignorance. They cloud our mental faculties and drive our actions in ways that create further insecurity. We might say that if avidya is the darkness, then defilements are what we bump into while stumbling around in the dark. In our everyday lives, delusion clouds our perception of reality. When we encounter people or objects, this fundamental misunderstanding prevents us from recognizing their inherently impermanent nature. Instead, we instinctively project qualities of permanence, satisfaction, and personal identity onto our perceptions. These misperceptions serve as the foundation from which various mental impurities emerge. We develop attachment toward what appears pleasant, resistance toward what seems unpleasant, and remain under the spell of delusion regarding the true nature of both of these conditions. All the while, this cycle of misperceptions and conditioned reactions continues to shape our engagement with the world around us. Surprisingly, although avidya is commonly understood as being a fundamental form of ignorance, it actually operates in a far more sophisticated manner than a mere cloud of confusion. Its true power lies in its uncanny ability to transform itself into the very values and beliefs we cherish most dearly. This creates an insidious trap for the mind. More than simply obscuring reality, avidya actively disguises itself as our most deeply held opinions in order to tempt craving into gleefully latching onto them and holding on tightly. Thus, rather than appearing as an obvious obstacle to our progress, avidya masquerades as our most treasured convictions, making it far more difficult for us to recognize and overcome such attachments. The deception is particularly effective because we rarely suspect that our ideals could be vehicles for our misplaced desires and attachments. This deception allows avidya to become indistinguishable from what we consider to be most authentic about ourselves. Consider how we cling to our sense of personal identity, believing it to be a precious and essential truth about who we are. We identify with our thoughts, our feelings, and our perceptions as being ours, causing us to boast of our knowledge, take pride in our virtuous actions, and feel delight in our spiritual attainments. Yet this very identification with I and mine demonstrates that fundamental ignorance is hard at work. Paradoxically, the more refined and virtuous our sense of self-worth progresses, the more subtle and beguiling avidya's influence becomes. This fundamental ignorance creates a false duality, from which all our concepts of right and wrong or good and evil emerge. The entire structure of samsara, that endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, rests upon this deluded foundation. It truly functions as the seed of all existence, the nucleus around which all experience revolves. Avidya persists throughout countless lifetimes, not because it hides from view, but because it has convinced us that its effects are actually our own independent actions. Like a masterful puppeteer, it remains out of sight by making us believe its strings are actually our own limbs moving freely. This deception doesn't merely manipulate our feelings and desires, it distorts our perception of reality too. All other mental defilements, like greed, hatred, and delusion in their myriad forms, flow from this single source. Like tributaries branching out from a mighty river, they can all be traced back to avidya. This is why addressing these secondary defilements without tackling their root cause can never lead to complete freedom from avidya's influence. While the second noble truth explicitly names tanha as the cause of suffering, this assessment represents a practical perspective rather than an ultimate one. Tanha is identified as the cause because it's the most immediately actionable link in the causal chain of suffering. Our craving, whether for sensual pleasures, continued existence, or non-existence, creates direct and observable suffering when it goes unfulfilled, or when the satisfaction we obtain through craving's unquenchable thirst fails to last. Avidya operates at a deeper level. It's our fundamental misunderstanding of reality, which prevents us from seeing things as they truly are, particularly our ignorance concerning the true nature of impermanence, of not-self, and of the nature of suffering itself. This foundational ignorance conditions all subsequent mental formations, including the workings of tanha. The Buddha was primarily concerned with providing a practical path to liberation. By focusing on tanha in the second noble truth, he identified something directly observable and workable. We can witness the effects of ceaseless craving in real time and begin examining them. The third and fourth Noble Truths then outlined the final destination and the path to reach that goal. They reveal to us that suffering can end through the cessation of craving and show us how to achieve this objective. In a sense, tanha functions as the proximate cause of suffering, while avijja serves as its root condition. One of the Buddha's teaching strategies was to start with what's most immediately recognizable and actionable, which in this case is craving. By beginning with the experience of craving, something we can perceive arising in our minds moment to moment, he provides a practical entry point for more profound insights. The practitioner who works to understand and release craving eventually encounters the deeper distortions of perception that sustain it, which are created by avijja's fundamental misunderstanding of reality. This teaching strategy reflects the medical model the Buddha often used. First, identify the symptom, suffering. Then diagnose the immediate cause, craving. Trace that back to the underlying disease, ignorance. And lastly, prescribe the appropriate medicine, the Noble Eightfold Path. The advantage of this method is its practicality. We don't need to fully comprehend the profound nature of avijja before we can begin making progress. We simply start working with what we can clearly see within ourselves. As we continue this practice, we gradually penetrate to that deeper level where our misunderstanding of reality and our craving to exist intersect, which is precisely where our sense of self takes shape. Much like two great rivers joining together, these powerful currents of ignorance and craving create something more binding than either one on its own. The ignorance blinds us to the true nature of reality, while the craving propels us forward into continuous becoming. Where they meet, they generate the illusory but compelling sense that I exist as a separate, permanent entity. We can begin to discern this process only by carefully investigating how it operates in our own minds. As a first step, we should examine how this works in our everyday experiences. A thought arises and instantly follows the notion, I am thinking. An emotion surfaces and immediately appears. I am angry, or I am happy. A physical sensation occurs, and at once emerges, I am in pain, or I feel good. At each moment, the misunderstanding that these experiences have something solid behind them comes together with bhavatanha, the craving to be a continuing entity, and out of the intersection of these elemental forces arises the strong conviction that this is me, this is mine, this is who I am. The Buddha's teaching on not-self points directly to this illusion. He didn't say that there is no conventional self. Obviously, we function in the world with names and roles and responsibilities. What he pointed out was that when we look closely, we can't find any permanent, unchanging core that could be rightfully called a self. There are just the ever-changing processes of body and mind flowing on continuously. I often think of our sense of self as being similar to watching a film. A film is merely a series of still images played in rapid succession, creating the illusion of continuous motion. Likewise, our sense of self is composed of a rapid series of perceptual moments, each arising and ceasing in quick succession. Our failure to recognize the flickering nature of consciousness, combined with our innate craving for existence, creates the convincing illusion of a continuous and permanent self-identity that persists unchanged through time. When we begin to see through this illusion, even momentarily, we experience an initial taste of freedom. We are no longer quite so bound by the anxieties, fears, and desires that come from maintaining this sense of self through all its various changes. We begin to hold more lightly to our identities, to our stories about ourselves, and to our concern with how others see us. The Buddha wasn't asking us to faithfully believe in his teaching as indisputable fact. He was inviting us to investigate our own experience to see if the teaching holds true. Is there anything in our experience that doesn't change? Is there anything we can point to and say with absolute certainty, this is the real me? Or, when we look closely, do we find that everything is flowing and changing, arising and ceasing due entirely to momentary conditions? The answers to such questions form the basis of Buddhist practice, revealing how our suffering stems from avijja's fundamental misunderstanding about existence. Freedom emerges through cultivating wisdom that penetrates the heart of this misunderstanding. This wisdom unfolds when we directly investigate the nature of experience, observing the mind's inherent processes without identification or attachment. As our investigation deepens, we gradually dissolve layers of delusion, which challenges our most basic assumptions about ourselves and the world around us. Through persistent practice, our insights grow increasingly sharp and penetrating as they illuminate the path toward total freedom. When wisdom finally pierces through the deception of avijja, something unexpected occurs. Rather than discovering a new state or acquiring special knowledge, we witness the complete collapse of the edifice that ignorance has built. Like a veil lifting to reveal what was always present, a pure mind, unblemished by any sense of self or other, emerges. This unconditioned emptiness isn't something created or attained. It has been there all along, merely obscured by the fog of ignorance. This revelation is nibbana, the supreme happiness that comes from the total cessation of ignorance and craving. It marks the end of our fabricated sense of self-identity. What remains is absolute freedom, complete and unconditioned. The Buddha's teachings illuminate a profound truth, yet this wisdom must be validated through personal inquiry rather than accepted on faith alone. Neither intellectual understanding nor deeply held beliefs can replace the transformative power of direct knowing, that singular moment of clarity which extinguishes craving and dispels ignorance. This truth underscores why dedicated practice remains indispensable, because it alone shines wisdom's light on the primordial darkness that has chained us to suffering throughout countless lifetimes.